Genene Jones worked as a licensed vocational nurse in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Behar County Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, during 1981 and 1982. The unit, now part of University Hospital, was responsible for treating some of the most fragile young patients. It was in this setting that troubling signs began to emerge, signs that would later become central to one of the most disturbing cases in American medical history. During Jones's employment, an unusual pattern of medical emergencies and sudden infant deaths appeared. These incidents were not scattered randomly across the schedule. Instead, they repeatedly occurred during her assigned hours, most often between 3 p.m. and 11 p.m. The correlation between her presence and the sharp rise in unexplained crises earned this period an ominous label among hospital staff: the death shift. In October 1981, a fellow nurse noticed that too many babies under Jones's care were dying from conditions that were typically survivable. The anomalies were not small, isolated incidents, but consistent irregularities that alarmed those working in the intensive care unit. The matter was taken to the head nurse, and an internal inquiry was launched. The findings were striking. Genene Jones had been present during every one of the questionable deaths. Despite such damning results, the hospital did not involve law enforcement. Instead, administrators quietly reassigned Jones under the guise of staffing changes. The pediatric ICU was formally moved to an all-registered nurse staff, and Jones, an LVN, was dismissed. To conceal suspicion, the hospital even provided her with favorable recommendation. In January 1983, senior physicians held a meeting to discuss the unfolding situation. Records later revealed that they decided not to disclose their knowledge to outside authorities. Their inaction was compounded by the destruction of critical medical evidence. Tons of hospital records were shredded, despite a preservation order. Prosecutors later explained that this act crippled their ability to pursue charges in dozens of cases, leaving many suspected deaths unresolved. Investigators would later allege that Jones used powerful drugs, including digoxin, heparin, and muscle relaxants, secretly injecting children with fatal overdoses. These suspicions marked the beginning of a dark saga that continued long after her departure. After leaving Behar County Hospital, Genene Jones found employment at a small pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas. The change of setting did not end the troubling pattern of medical emergencies. Once again, children under her care began suffering unexpected crises, many of them fatal. What had been whispered suspicions in San Antonio soon became undeniable reality in Kerrville. The pivotal case occurred in September 1982 with the death of 15-month-old Chelsea and McClellan. Chelsea had been taken to the clinic for a routine vaccination. Jones administered the injection, but within a short time Chelsea began seizing. She was rushed toward a hospital in San Antonio, but before reaching the facility, she went into cardiac arrest. Despite resuscitation efforts, Chelsea died. Dr. Kathleen Holland, who ran the clinic and worked alongside Jones, was deeply unsettled by the incident. She ordered tests, which revealed traces of succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant, in Chelsea's body. This drug causes paralysis and respiratory failure if administered improperly. The discovery prompted Holland to check the clinic's medication supply. She found a bottle of succinylcholine that had been tampered with. Needle punctures in the lid showed it had been accessed without authorization. Even more suspicious, part of the missing drug had been replaced with saline solution in an attempt to disguise the theft. Only 2 people had access to that medication: Dr. Holland herself and Genene Jones. The evidence pointed clearly toward Jones. Acting swiftly, Holland dismissed her from the clinic and reported her suspicions to authorities. Investigators reviewed other recent child cases and soon uncovered a wider pattern. By 1984, prosecutors brought Jones to trial. She was charged with the murder of Chelsea McClellan, convicted, and sentenced to 99 years in prison. Later that same year, she faced another trial for the January 1982 poisoning of 4-week-old Rolando Santos. Rolando had been injected with heparin, a blood thinner, but survived the ordeal. Jones was convicted of injuring a child and received a concurrent 60-year sentence. Prosecutors argued that Jones may have deliberately created emergencies to cast herself as a miracle working nurse or to demonstrate the need for an intensive care unit. Whatever the motive, the convictions marked the first time authorities directly confronted her actions. For the families of victims, it was a beginning of long-awaited accountability. Decades after her convictions, Genene Jones's name returned to public attention in a way that alarmed families and prosecutors alike. A Texas law, designed to ease prison overcrowding, allowed inmates to earn good time credits that reduced their sentences. Under this statute, Jones was scheduled for mandatory release in March 2018. Despite having been sentenced to decades in prison for murder and child injury, having served just one-third of her original sentence, she was preparing to walk free. For the families of her victims, the news was devastating. Among those most horrified was Petty McClellan, mother of 15-month-old Chelsea, whose murder had led to Jones's first conviction. Petty, unwilling to accept the possibility that Jones might soon return to society, launched a campaign to prevent her release. She joined forces with victims advocate Andy Kahan, who had long worked on criminal justice reform and support for families. Together, they raised public awareness and pressured authorities to reopen old cases tied to Jones's history. In 2014, District Attorney Nico LaHood was elected in Behar County. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, he committed his office to preventing Jones from leaving prison. LaHood established a specialized task force to revisit the allegations surrounding the unexplained deaths of infants decades earlier. Assistant District Attorney Jason Goss, who had not even been born when many of the crimes occurred, took charge of the renewed investigation. Goss combed through courthouse archives and surviving files, working to reconstruct cases long hindered by time and by the destruction of hospital records. Though the absence of critical medical charts presented enormous obstacles, the team pressed forward. Their efforts, combined with the persistence of families, kept the pursuit of justice alive and set the stage for the next chapter in the long legal battle. In the painstaking process of rebuilding a case against Genene Jones decades after her original conviction, prosecutors uncovered what they would later describe as a smoking gun. While many hospital records from the 1980s had vanished, one document survived the passage of time and proved pivotal. In 2011, Jones had written a letter to the Texas Board of Nursing, seeking to explain her past and expressing remorse. Within that letter, she admitted to having committed heinous acts and acknowledged the terrible harm she had inflicted. Though she stopped short of naming any individual victims, her language conveyed more than vague regret. It read as a tacit confession. For District Attorney Nico LaHood and Assistant District Attorney Jason Goss, this letter became a cornerstone in their renewed prosecution efforts. It offered, in Jones's own words, an admission of guilt that prosecutors could point to as evidence of her responsibility for the deaths of children under her care. Alongside the letter, investigators highlighted earlier statements Jones had made in prison. In a 1998 interview with a parole officer, she was reported to have said bluntly, "I really did kill those babies." These chilling words, though made informally, reinforced the conclusion that Jones herself had acknowledged the crimes long after her conviction. LaHood anticipated that Jones's defense team would challenge the admissibility of both the letter and the prison interview, arguing that they were either too ambiguous or improperly obtained. Still, he and his team were determined to present them to a jury. In the absence of direct medical records, these self-incriminating remarks provided a powerful alternative, breathing new life into cases once thought impossible to prosecute. By the mid-2010s, the case against Genene Jones was no longer confined to suspicion and whispers. In 2017, the Behar County District Attorney's Office unveiled a dramatic turn. Jones was formally charged with the murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer, who had died in December 1981 after receiving a massive and unexplained overdose of Dilantin, a powerful anti-seizure medication. For decades, Joshua's death had remained one of the many unexplained tragedies shadowing Jones's career, but modern forensic reviews and renewed investigative efforts gave prosecutors the confidence to bring the charge forward. The momentum did not stop there. Over the following months, Jones faced 4 additional indictments tied to the deaths of infants Richard "Ricky" Nelson, Rosemary Vega, Paul Villarreal, and Patrick Zavala, all of whom had died while under her care between 1981 and 1982. Each indictment was paired with a $1 million bond, effectively guaranteeing that Jones would not walk free once her original sentence expired. Families who had lived with unanswered questions for decades were finally presented with a path toward justice. Initially, Jones pleaded not guilty to all charges. Her defense signaled its readiness to challenge the evidence, highlighting the age of the cases and the difficulty of proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt nearly 40 years later. Prosecutors, however, countered with a formidable arsenal: hospital records, testimony from medical experts, and nearly 200 potential witnesses who were prepared to testify about Jones's history of suspicious behavior, sudden patient declines, and her own incriminating statements. As the January 2020 trial date drew closer, Jones abruptly shifted her stance. Facing the overwhelming scope of evidence and the possibility of multiple consecutive life sentences, she chose to accept a plea deal. In January, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Joshua Sawyer, while 4 other indictments were dismissed as part of the agreement. The decision stunned some observers, but brought a measure of closure to families who had waited decades for answers. During the sentencing hearing, relatives of the victims delivered emotional impact statements that underscored the devastation Jones had inflicted. Mothers spoke directly to her, their voices breaking with grief and rage. One parent told the court that every milestone, birthdays, graduations, weddings, was forever lost because of Jones's actions. Another described the cruel irony of entrusting their baby to someone sworn to provide care, only to have that trust betrayed in the most horrifying way. The presiding judge acknowledged their pain, stating that no sentence could ever restore the lives lost or erase the suffering endured by the families. Still, the court emphasized that the plea ensured Jones would spend the rest of her life in prison, far removed from vulnerable children. Under the terms of the deal, Jones received a life sentence and will not be eligible for parole until 2038. By then, she will be 87 years old, an age that makes the prospect of her release unlikely. For prosecutors, this outcome represented the closest possible measure of justice. District Attorney Nico LaHood expresses hope that Jones would never leave prison alive, ensuring that no other family would suffer at her hands again. For the families, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had come late, but it had come at last. As of today, Genene Jones remains incarcerated, serving her life sentence. Now an elderly woman in failing health, she is expected to die behind bars. After decades of uncertainty, her guilty plea in 2020 finally ensured that she would never walk free again. For many of the families whose children died under her care, this outcome represented long-awaited justice, though the pain of their loss has never diminished. Parents described the guilty plea as both a relief and a torment: relief that Jones would never harm another child, and torment that it had taken nearly 4 decades to reach this point. The case left deep scars on families who were forced to grieve in silence for years. Several parents, including Petty McClellan and Juanita Villarreal, did not live long enough to see Jones held fully accountable. For others, the drawn-out legal battle added layers of frustration and anguish as they fought tirelessly against a system that had once failed to protect their children. Beyond the families, the Jones case has had a lasting impact on the medical and legal communities. It exposed glaring systemic failures, destroyed evidence, hospital administrators who prioritize reputation over safety, and prosecutors who struggled for years to gather enough proof for conviction. These shortcomings meant that Jones was able to continue working with children for far too long, with devastating consequences. Prosecutors emphasized that the plea deal was the only practical way to guarantee Jones will remain incarcerated until the end of her life. While some criticized the dismissal of multiple charges, officials argued that securing her permanent imprisonment was more important than risking acquittal in a complex trial nearly 40 years after crimes. The legacy of the case is sobering. It reflects the extraordinary persistence of grieving families, the consequences of institutional cover-ups, and the chilling reality of how one nurse betrayed her duty of care to harm society's most vulnerable. For many, Genene Jones will forever be remembered as a reminder of the devastating consequences when oversight and accountability fail. This case is a chilling reminder of how long justice can be delayed, but also how persistence can finally bring the truth to light. The families may never fully heal, yet their fight ensured that Genene Jones will never harm another child again. If you found this story powerful, do not forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime documentaries. Your support helps us continue uncovering stories that must never be forgotten.